Hello, my name is Oscar. I study at the Pan American University of Puerto in the Faculty of Education and Humanities School of Modern Languages. In today's video, we're going to take a look at the history of English literature. We're going to go over some of the most important periods in history of English literature and explain very briefly a few key points of in regards to the most relevant aspects and characteristics of each period. And of course, we're going to mention the time that characterized each period as well. So let's zoom in here and start with the Old English period. The Old English period, as we can see here, we can we can establish it from the year 450 to the year 1066. This is the Old English period. And this period begins with the Anglo-Saxon settlement in Britain. And regarding its key features, we can mention the oral tradition and heroic poetry and the alliteration instead of rhyme. We can mention also that the main themes in during this time period are themes of faith, loyalty, and warfare. So this period, the Old English period, is the foundation of English literary expression. It was strongly influenced by by Germanic culture and pagan values, later blended with Christian elements. So, as we can see, always literature, the history of literature and arts is always very closely tied to the history itself, because art, and in this case, literature, which is an expression and art form, it is an expression, both an expression and a reflection of the time period, of the culture and its people during a specific place and a specific time. So that's the Old English period. Now, moving on to the Middle English period, we can establish it from the year 1066 to the year 1500. So this is the Middle English period. So this begins after the Norman conquest, which introduced something else, French influence. Now, French influence into English language and culture. So the key features or some relevant aspects that we can point about the Middle English period is, for example, the emergence of vernacular English, also a a search of religious and moral themes, as well as the development of narrative poetry. So during this time period, English becomes a legitimate literary language, and it actually reflects a more diverse and socially structured society. So that is everything regarding the most relevant aspects of the Middle English period, and we move on here to the Renaissance. The Renaissance is the time period established between 1500 and 1660. As we know, the Renaissance was a extremely important time period for humanity, as it was basically the ending or the new era after the medieval time period that was characterized by a lack of progress and even a backwards movement in in many aspects of human life and culture. But the Renaissance came as a revolution on many aspects of human life. And so in this we can see this clearly reflected in literature. So as I said, this is a period of revival in arts and learning, and it was inspired by classical antiquity. So a few aspects important to the Renaissance regarding the English literature is, for example, humanism and focus on individual potential. Also, we see the flourishing of drama and poetry, as well as the explorations of politics, love, and identity. Here we can name a couple of notable authors such as William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe. And again, and in regards to the relevance of the Renaissance, we can say that it is considered the golden age of English literature, especially in drama, with lasting influence on language and storytelling. So this is one of the most crucial points in both in universal history as well as the history of literature. So let's continue now to the next period, which we have right here, which is the Restoration period, established between 1660 and 1700. So regarding the Restoration period, we can tie that or relate that to the return of the monarchy under Charles II. And we can name as well a few key and relevant aspects of the Restoration period, which include in literature an inclusion of satire and wit, as well as a reaction against Puritanism, and as well a rise in theatrical comedy. So literature in this time period becomes bolder and more open to criticize society, as well as mocking political figures or moral issues. So it is a very interesting exploration of critique on, I don't mean to say disguised, but through humor and wit, but it is a critique. So literature becomes a way to provide social critic, political critic, and and establish that influence and that dialogue in those aspects of society. So it comes to be a cultural force that transcends arts alone, or the spiritual plane of the art in relation to the human spirit, and also begins to impact society in, as I said, in themes such as politics. So a very important period there. Then we move on here to the Augustan age. So the Augustan age is named after classical ideals of Roman Emperor Augustus. And it spawns from 1700 to 1785. So it is almost the totality of that century. And talking about some key aspects of the Augustan age, it we can find a emphasis on reason, order, and clarity. Again, we continue with the humor now in the way of satire, in both in literary works but also essays, and and we can find neoclassical ideals. Some notable authors from this time period include Alexander Pope and Jonathan Swift. So English literature during the Augustan age reflects again a very important movement for both history and arts and universal history, which is the Enlightenment. And we start to see Enlightenment values in literature. So works of art or of literature that promote rational thought and social critique. A very interesting time indeed. So moving on, we have the Romantic period, spawning from 1785 to 1832. So in this case, the Romantic period comes to be as a reaction against industrialization and rationalism, which was again one of the main values of the previous age, the previous period, rationalism. So we find what we find. So if this is a reaction, we're going to find, of course, an emphasis on emotion and nature, but also a celebration of the individual, but also an interest in the supernatural. And a couple of relevant authors that we can find for this time period are William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. So during this time period, literature introduces a new poetic sensibility centered on imagination and subjective experience. Now, we move on to the Victorian period, spawning from 1832 to 1901. This corresponds with the reign of Queen Victoria. And a few things that we're going to see during this time period in literature are realism, but again, social criticism. So we can see how since the Augustan age, in close relation to the Illustration movement, critical thinking and critique comes to be or establishes itself in the cultural landscape of society, and it keeps going during the Romantic period and now the Victorian period. It only changes to mold with other aspects of that were popular during the time, but that aspect of social critique spawned and didn't fade away with the next periods or ages, but rather it kept going and transforming. So it became an everlasting quality of literature. Not in every work of literature, of course, but as an established characteristic that is found in many works of art. So circling back to the Victorian period, we can find a couple of legendary authors, which were Charles Dickens and Charlotte Bronte Tate. And as I was saying, literature during this time period becomes a tool to examine social problems and human conditions through rapid industrial change. Okay, so it is very interesting to me to see that relation between society and criticism of society and politics through literature, through literary works, sorry, and understanding that even though literature became a vessel for that critique, it didn't undermine artistic, the intrinsic artistic value of these works. They weren't political propaganda, so to say, but there was a union, a balance between work of art and social messaging. In response to, of course, the problems and the difficulties that the society was facing during each time period. So again, during the Victorian period, we see that very tied to the Industrial Revolution. So it is a fascinating quality of art in general, not only literature. But we are almost done with our timeline. We're going to focus now on the modern period, spanning from 1901 to 1945. So the modern period, of course, was marked by World War I and some significant cultural shifts. So what we find during the modern period is an experimentation period with different narrative techniques. Also, we find themes of fragmentation and disillusionment after the horrors of World War One, and also tied to that, a stream of consciousness after everything that transpired during that time. Some notable authors are James Joyce and Virginia Woolf. And what this period left us with was a break with traditional forms to reflect a more complex and uncertain modern life that came to be. But now we turn to finally the postmodern period from 1945 to the present day. And again, we notice that this period is again marked by another world war. In this case, this period develops after World War II, and again questions established narratives. And we find that in literature during this time period, we see a rise of metafiction and intertextuality, but also irony and playfulness, and a blurring of genres. We can find that two relevant authors to this time period are Salman Rushdie and Margaret Atwood. And the main theme of the postmodern period that we can find is a challenge of the absolute truth and the emphasis on multiple perspectives and cultural diversity. So let's zoom out a little bit so we can appreciate again all the history of English literature. And again, it's fascinating to me just to study this history, looking at it, and knowing that we're looking at the history of humanity, a reflection of history of humanity in art, in this case, literature. So that's why, for me, looking at history of art is is a fascinating way to get a glimpse of the culture and of the people that live in different time periods, as well as the how interesting it is to see the transformation and development of an art form. So this will be all for today's video regarding the history of English literature. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you and goodbye for now.